Welcome to the Beacon Hill Podcast, helping you grow in your faith and shine for Christ. Thanks for joining us. Now here are your hosts, Pastor G.J. Farmer and the Beacon Hill Baptist Church staff.
Hello again. Welcome back to another week of the podcast. I'm back this week. Appreciate you all being on last week. I was in Paducah when you all shot that.
Yeah, it was way more fun here.
Yeah, it was a long drive. But you say it was way more fun. You were supposed to be there with us so you could have seen Duke lose in my presence.
I'm actually glad that we weren't watching that game together because,
well,
I don't know if I'd be here right now. Might have been out of
I
here.
literally don't care about either one.
Well, that's unfortunate for
But the
you.
Gamecocks are ranked number 19, so I'm happy.
In basketball?
In football.
Oh, okay.
Football's almost over. And if you're a Kentucky fan, it was over about 3 weeks
Yeah,
ago.
this LSU season was over 3 weeks ago. So
Listen, give me something.
that's
well-
very nice.
If you're listening, I'm here with Jake and Jessica today. We started a series, book study, whatever you want to call it, through Luke. So obviously we're going to be in Luke for a while together. Started in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, where Luke basically gives his introduction and talks about how he went about, compiling the book and writing the book. And he said that he interviewed and talked to eyewitnesses and servants of, as it says, servants of the word who had written scripture down and the teachings of Jesus and told them, and Luke basically investigated everything and compiled it all into a gospel. And we were talking about Sunday how just like Luke wanted to be accurate in how he portrayed the gospel and had some goals in that, since we are gospel sharers as well, we too should care about how we share the gospel. We talked about how Luke wanted to be reliable and credible and available in sharing the gospel. He was reliable in that he wanted to make sure everything was factual. He was credible in that he himself had been impacted by what he was writing. He himself believed it. And he was available in that really the reason he was writing this is so Theophilus could read it and ultimately others, including us. And so he made himself available, made the gospel available. All of these things impact us, and we should be reliable, credible, and available. We're going to kind of talk about a few of these today, just get into a little bit more specific application. But one of the things we said in being reliable was the fact that we needed to be growing more in the Word. Like if we want to be more reliable when people talk to us about God, we need to kind of be, knowledgeable, yes, but even more like we need to be truthful. And sometimes that means sharing truth that's easy to share, that's, when you're talking about like the good news of Jesus and things like that. When people ask us questions or we're talking to people, sometimes the truth is difficult to share if we know that maybe even if we're trying to be loving or positive in what we're doing, sometimes it can be offensive in the things that we believe and that God's word says. And so sometimes even in that, like even in times that we might be offensive, we have to be truthful and reliable. And then just in thinking about all of that, there are times we talked about Sunday where being reliable might just mean saying like, I don't know, and just being truthful and factual in that, and not just making something up or saying something, just that you've always heard or whatever. And then maybe going back and trying to learn or look it up and come back to them later perhaps. But all of these things make us more reliable when it comes to sharing the Word of God. So we're talking about Sunday to do that, to become more reliable, it's good to study the Bible. And I just thought, practically speaking, we could kind of share, like, if you had one piece of like go-to advice for somebody who wanted to grow in their Bible study or get a little bit deeper in the Word, what would that like go-to piece of advice be? What would be that thing that you would say, this is maybe above all else, just something that would be super helpful. Jake, we know you're full of helpful advice.
Yes.
And quotes and movie quotes, TV
oh my gosh,
quotes.
I've got so many things running through my mind right now. Let me pick the best one.
Yeah, that's the hard thing for you is
they're
just
all
whittling it
gold.
down to one.
Well, the first thing that came to mind to me is just like for those of us who kind of grew up in church, a lot of times we have heard verses quoted, and we've heard things like you should do this or you shouldn't do that and all those things, but we've never actually read it ourselves, and we've never actually looked at the context that it's in. And I think that for, like I said, for those of us who have been believers for a long time and are kind of struggling to, because sometimes it can just feel like I've grown up in church my whole life. I know a lot about the Bible. What do I need to study? Can kind of be our attitude. And I think that for us, we need to just think about like, okay, have I actually read through these kind of common verses that I know, or have I just kind of heard it passed along? And then really being able to find those passages and then really dig into the history and the context of what was said. All those things have been super helpful for me, not only to be able to quote a common verse, but actually be able to explain it because I know the context with which it was written and all those things.
Well, even with that, as you think about familiar passages, if you've been in church a good while, probably a lot of passages are familiar to you. Probably as we're going through Luke, there will be a number of things that are familiar. But as we go throughout life and our life situations change, or just the situations of culture and the world changes, there might be new ways that something applies to us. Now, it doesn't mean that the meaning of the text changes, but it means that there could be other avenues of application that we haven't really thought about. Like, for instance, when we are kids or teenagers, a certain passage probably applies to us in a little bit different way than maybe when we're middle adults with kids or senior adults, thinking about our grandkids. There are different applications that happen sometime, and that's why we need to constantly refresh ourselves on the Word, and even be looking at some of those things with fresh eyes. Jessica, what do you think?
Well, I have several for this because
Okay.
this is one of my favorite kind of questions. So kind of piggybacking on what you said, context is very important. And I think a lot of times we don't get the full context of what's happening in the Bible, what the who wrote it, where the setting of where it was, things like that, or the type of literature. I know you talked about there's poetry in there, and then there's some historical stuff. I mean, a lot of historical stuff, but there's different types of things. So I think that's important. And then also, I always tell our kids here at church and at home, like every time we go to a familiar story, because a lot of times they'll be like, we've already learned this, but you can always learn something new. And even as an adult, like I'll read it now and be like, whoa, I didn't catch that one word that kind of changes the context of that verse, like makes it.
It's so funny because we hear our kids say that and we're
Yeah.
like, yes, you can, da, da, da. But then in our own lives, we're like, oh, I'm good.
Yeah.
We're so quick to do the same thing.
Yeah, but I think that's really important, is just to remember that you can always learn something new. And one way that you can help with that is reading. I know you mentioned on Sunday about different translations. And one thing that has always helped me is just to take that verse or that passage and read it in another translation, compare it to another translation. Because a lot of times you can get the richness of the full word that you're looking at, or the passage that you're looking at, specific verse. You can understand it even better when you kind of see that context of those the different words to describe it, it might give it a little bit more meaning to it. I wrote these down too because I had to write down my favorite things.
She actually has a lot of stuff.
I do. I'm sorry. This is something that I like.
A lot of stuff.
This is something that this
She
is a
missed
topic
the part
I really
that said
like.
one piece of advice, but go ahead. These are good.
One
Here
of
we
my
go. Here we
favorite
We're just
favorite
picking up.
ones is to always look for God, not yourself. And so when you're reading a passage, you want to look for God's character in it. What can you learn about God in this passage or in this chapter or whatever you're reading? What is he like? What is he not like? What upsets him? Like you're really looking for who God is in everything that you read. So that was the one. And then I was just going to say, like, find a plan and stick to it. And if you have a day where you forget to read, just go in and read like a couple of verses. Like, don't get down on yourself because, oh my gosh, I forgot to go read my Bible. You know, you don't have to read 3-4 chapters a day. I mean, you can go and read a couple of verses as long as you're in the Word every day and as much as you can be. But if you forget a day, give yourself some grace.
Yeah. And I think all that stuff's super important. You know, the context, I think, is a huge thing. For instance, I think one of the worst things that we can do, and I think a lot of people do this, is just like open your Bible and jump in and like read a verse randomly. You know, I was reading this powerful verse. It says this, and he said to him, I'll give you all these things if you'll fall down and worship me. And, you know, that's really great promise that if we worship the Lord, that he's going to give us like all the things we need.
Yeah.
But really that's Satan to Jesus and the temptation.
Yeah.
There are several like that, but
I mean, I want a Ferrari.
yeah.
I hadn't got one
But
yet.
if you like, it's funny because I've seen things like that shared on social media just to kind of get attention, where it'll like just pull the verse out of context, and then like if you look in the comments and stuff, it'll say, "Oh, by the way, this is Satan, and this is how important it is to not
Right.
take things out of context."
Well, on a more serious note with that too, that's how a lot of people are justifying sin, is pulling stuff out of context.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how, you know, going back to what Jake said, a lot of things that we assume or just think that we know are things that have been taught to us from things out of context. I can't tell you how many times, and this happens in every church I've been a part of, whether a pastor or a member. People get these ideas of like, and we talked about like man-made traditions and man-made teachings, and they get certain ideas of like things being in the Bible, and then when they go to the Bible, if they find any support for some of these things, it's typically a verse that's taken out of context, that it's like, well, okay, if you actually look at what this means, this doesn't actually mean that. And sometimes, you know, people can get just the wrong idea about things, and it's because of that reason. So I'd encourage that, and I think a lot has already been said, so I'll just add on kind of what Jessica mentioned that I talk about quite frequently, making sure you read the Bible in a translation you understand. You know, there's nothing... I'll say there's nothing more boring and useless than reading something that you don't understand because of its language or whatever. You know, if I picked up some kind of medical journal or something like that and just started reading in some kind of, you know, language that I didn't understand, where I had to look up every definition of everything, it would be very time consuming, very frustrating. And if I know a lot of people around this area kind of stay with the King James, not because they love it, but because that's what they grew up on and that's what they feel like they should do. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But let me encourage you, like, if you can't understand a certain translation, try to find one you can understand. You still want to get one that's accurate. You don't want to just like trust anything and everything. But at the same time, there are a lot of good translations out there that can help you understand what you're reading. Thinking about that, you know, we want to be reliable and factual in our witness, but we also want to be credible. And by credibility, we're talking about the actions of the person, you know, like not only do our words matter, but our actions matter, and our character and how we live and all of those things. So talk for just a second about why credibility matters in our witness, and then let's kind of look on the flip side a little bit and maybe think about how you've seen someone's credibility impact how you listen to them. And that doesn't necessarily have to be just within the church. It can be in other realms. But what are your all's thoughts on that? You want to jump in, Jessica? You want to go first?
Well, I mean, I just go into credibility.
We'll give Jake a little more time to think.
Here's
I
my
gotta really concentrate.
here's exactly what I wrote down was that this was just a dig at y'all, but that like I'm not a I'm not a Duke or a UK fan.
Let's go back to Jake. Jake.
I'm not a Duke or a UK fan. So if you were to come to me for stats, I have no credibility to tell you anything about it because I don't watch the game. I don't go to the games. I don't care about the games. I don't know anything about it.
Right.
Sorry, but I really had to dig y'all with that one. But
So that kind of affects the way we see you about everything. You know,
Yeah.
like
I have no credibility
no
now.
credibility at
Yeah,
all.
That makes sense now.
But I think that is important that we not only talk the talk but walk the walk, and that we're living that. And I will have to say, came in and told you this morning, you know, sometimes that's hard and we mess up and we have to think about it later, like, oh, I probably shouldn't have done that because who might have been watching me, you know, that sort of thing. And then when I think about someone's credibility and how it impacted me, well, first of all, I think about like kids ministry. You know, if we're not real, then they're not gonna listen to us at all. And so I think that's really important that we have to be real in the way we are. We have to if we're gonna talk about it, then that's how we need to act. And you know, someone else that comes to my mind is just my mom and how she handled her disease, because all the way through she's praising God the whole time up until the very end. I mean, that Sunday morning singing along with, you know, I'm singing along with Jake and she's trying to raise her hand. And so I think she's been a big impact on me, on someone who didn't even have to say words, but I got to see her living out her faith all the way to the end.
Yeah, that's awesome. Jake, have you had some time now?
Sorry,
Yeah.
your feelings are hurt now.
I got one. I got to say it before it leaves. No. Yeah, I think that one of the things that we have to remember, especially when we're sharing the gospel with people that we know are non-believers, is they're not grounded in the truth of Jesus. And so, like, really one of the only things they have to go on at first is how they see Christians acting, how they see them handling certain situations, how they, you know, handle, you know, just learning truth and how we explain what we believe. And so I think that that's really important for us, not only to grow closer to God, we need to be living out what we believe. But also, if we want to be someone who is credible to non-believers, then we need to be able to look like we actually believe what we're saying. And if we're doing the opposite, it doesn't even look like we believe what's coming out of our own mouths. And so, like, I remember working, I had a bunch of secular jobs before I got into ministry, and I had like this guy that was an atheist. But every now and then he would just ask me, like, hey, as a Christian, how would you handle this situation? And it was usually like he was having trouble with his wife, or he, you know, had just like serious life stuff. And he would ask me like how I would react to it. And then it got us into talking about Jesus after that. And so if I wasn't, and not that I wasn't, you know, some kind of all-star Christian or whatever, but if I didn't look like I was doing what I told him every day, then he wouldn't be coming to me to ask me questions about practical things with life, and those doors wouldn't open to share. And so I think that's what we need to we need to realize, one, that we're talking to people who don't know Jesus, so we shouldn't expect them to act like they know Jesus. And then two, they're looking to us for an example. They're not looking to Scripture because they don't believe it yet. And so I think we're kind of the first line of that sharing.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And if you think about just credibility in general, I think we all have people who we've thought of that we're like, I don't really want to listen to what they have to say. Or, you look at the pastors over the last few years that have kind of what we would say fallen or whatever, and how it really taints a lot of their ministry. Like all of their, not, I would say like a good portion or all of their stuff might be reliable and factual, but when their credibility goes out the window, it really tarnishes. It makes you think twice of like, well, should I be reading his book or watching his sermon? So we've seen that happen before, unfortunately. But I was thinking about somebody who really credibility made a difference to me, even kind of outside of the church, in a way. When I was doing my dissertation for my doctoral work, my dissertation was on sermon conclusions, and it was a project where I had to preach sermons and basically assess my sermon conclusions and things like that. Anyway, I had to pick a chairperson who was going to kind of oversee my dissertation committee, and then I had to pick like a reader that would read it and help give me critique and all that. I could pick from any of the staff at Midwestern, including adjunct professors, any of the qualified people. And so I decided that I was going to pick two guys who were both adjunct professors because they were primarily pastors in churches. And for me, they had more credibility to speak into what I was doing because they also were doing those things every week. They weren't just, teachers who taught at schools and didn't actually practice those things every week. So the credibility, in my mind, made a huge difference in those instances. And I'll also add, I felt like since they were adjuncts, they might have graded it a little bit easier. So that's part of why I chose them. But the biggest thing, like I said, they just were in it every day. And I think that's another thing too, why it's important to just seem like to be real with people, is because that's going to help our credibility. Like if we seem fake or almost like, I don't know if you all have heard this saying, but like so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. I don't know if that makes sense to you all. Have you all heard that statement before? Basically, it's this idea of like we're just living in a Christian bubble and only around Christian people and only doing things that don't connect in a real way with the people in the world. Then as a result, we won't really have a witness with people because we're like just all the time just kind of in a Christian bubble. And so that's another thing. I think our credibility really makes a difference there when we're authentic with people. A couple of other things. We talked about making ourselves available. What do you think, like what would you say that means, kind of just in your own words, making yourself available to people and sharing the gospel? And what are some ways, just practically speaking, that we can do that? For me, I'll just kind of jump in first and you guys can jump in. The idea of being available is just being like ready and willing to share the gospel. Maybe putting yourself out there more. For me, I think just some practical ways to do that is trying to see those opportunities for those conversations and not backing down from them. And that can be a little bit tough, even for me sometimes, because, the easy thing for me is, well, if I'm standing on the platform in a church, I can share the gospel all day long, and that's super easy. But when you're like just putting it into normal conversations, that gets a little bit tougher. And so trying to find those opportunities to kind of connect with people in those ways, I think is important. What are your all's thoughts on those things, the availability?
I think we have to be willing I think the gospel is best shared within the application of like an actual friendship. Like we talked about this in the sharing the gospel without freaking out. Like sometimes you're going to be able to just walk up to a stranger maybe and say, you need to know Jesus, and have that be effective, because like the gospel is powerful and it could happen. But most of the time, those aren't the interactions that we're going to have when we're sharing Jesus. It's going to be within friendships that we have and all those things. And I think a lot of times just, I'm terrible about this, but like we just get so wrapped up in our own schedule, and we've got like, you know, the kids have sports and we got this to do, and we got church on Sunday and we got all these things. And I think we have to be willing to put aside some of our own, you know, personal time and things that we want to do sometimes to be able to be intentional about inviting somebody to lunch, or like if we get invited to some event by a friend who maybe doesn't know Jesus, being willing to kind of put something aside that maybe we wanted to do in order to be able to go and build that relationship up a little bit more, you know. And so that's way easier said than done, but especially these days with how busy everything is. But that for me is what I think would be most helpful, is just recognizing times when I need to sacrifice whatever I want to do and with my time, and being willing to be open to do whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say just being more mindful of looking for opportunities and just asking God to reveal it to you. I mean, just, you know, God, help me to see and to know exactly who I need to talk to today, or who I need to see, and to be consistent with it too, and not be discouraged after one no. You know, I was listening to a podcast today, and they were talking about it takes, I think it's it was like 16 no's to get a yes on sharing the gospel. And like in the business world, it's like 20 no's. Like in the sales world, is 20 no's before you get a yes. And so like we have a greater opportunity to, you know, win someone to the gospel versus selling them a car. But, you know, I mean, it's just, you got to be consistent with it and not get discouraged if you get turned away.
So in thinking about that, we all have somebody in our lives who's impacted us for the gospel. But even more than that, at the end of Sunday morning, I talked about how when we're faithful, a lot of times we impact people indirectly, and our reach is even bigger than we know, or at least anticipate. I'm curious if you all can think of somebody who impacted your life for the gospel in an indirect way, and just kind of share a little bit about why, who that is and why, or how they impacted your life.
I kind of thought about just the church that I was in when I made a profession of faith, and how they prioritized their youth program, and just those faithful givers who gave so that we could do camps and mission trips and things like that, to where, you know, decisions were made. And I mean, they didn't have to make that a priority. We weren't a big youth group. We weren't a big children's group. But they did that and put an emphasis on their youth so that kids could have that opportunity to know Jesus. And I mean, a lot of those people have already gone, and those are not people I can go back and say thank you, but if I could, I would, just to tell them thank you, because they don't know what their prayers and their sacrifice of giving and their time that they gave to the church, what it did for me and, you know, other people that went through that program.
What about you, Jake?
Yeah, I got saved at a young age, and so like I got saved on a Wednesday night in a kids' church or whatever, and I don't even remember the names of the teachers that were there at the time, but I just thought of that, like just being willing to have volunteers in the kids department and those types of things, to where you may think everybody, when you ask somebody, hey, can you volunteer or whatever, you always think like as a teacher or something, you're going to have to like be a professor of theology or something before you're able to teach a kid or even help, or but like just being there and being available. We talk about kids a lot, maybe come to church that don't have a great home life, and so like you may be the only parent or grandparent that really loves on them during the week, and like and so I think like we talk about like indirectly, like these are people that were at the church where we were at that I don't even remember the names of, but I know they led me to Jesus just in what they were able to do. And so I think, just a plug for the kids and the youth and all that, like, get involved as a volunteer if you're feeling that God's pulling you in that way at all, because you never know what kind of impact you're going to have just being there and just having conversations with the kids that maybe aren't even about church or Jesus or anything, but just that they associate good things when they're here. And that's huge.
And I told that story at our volunteer appreciation. We had a guy, this was a church that some lady picked me up and took me to church as a kid, and it was right up the street from our house. But Mr. Adrian, big, tall guy, older man, would meet us there at the door, give us candy, say hello. And I still to this day remember him. And the joke was that he would give us Tums if he didn't have candy. So we didn't know it at the time. We just thought it tasted really weird. But I remember that. I mean, and I'm, in my 40s, and I remember the man at the door giving us candy when I was like 7 or 8.
And you didn't have any indigestion?
Didn't. I mean, he saved me from all that.
Speaking of that, do you all remember that candy called like bottle caps? That was like Sweet Tarts or whatever in the little package, but they were more chalky, kind of like Tums or something.
Yeah.
That's what I think of when I think of that. Somebody that went through my mind was Alan Fisher. He's the pastor at Oak Hill. He was the student pastor when my wife was going to church there as a teenager, and she was saved and baptized under his ministry there. And I just think about in a lot of ways how him teaching and leading her in that period of time has not only affected my life but my kids' lives. And at that point in time when he knew Hillary, I was not in the picture at all. And, so that in a huge indirect way, he's impacted my family, probably for multiple generations. So it's really neat to think about how ministry and God's work is so much bigger than even us. Like it might go through us, but it continues on into other people. And so let that be an encouragement to you today as you're thinking about sharing the gospel, like the importance of, yes, reliability, credibility, and availability. But the biggest thing is, if you're thinking about like, hey, is it worth it? Or, what I would contribute is very small or very minor in the grand scheme of things. God uses our faithfulness and all of these other things we've talked about to impact and to grow his kingdom, because it's ultimately God who does all the work. As we wrap this up, if you were with us last week, you know that Jake had a really hard time landing the plane. And we actually edited a bit out of that because it got worse after the edit that I cut. You probably noticed like a few cents.
I kind of trailed off. Like I stopped speaking words.
Your brain stopped working.
It was like,
so I thought
it's 2:40 in the afternoon. I'm done.
So I thought I would let you land the plane today by telling about the good thing that happened to you on Friday.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, yeah.
Because you didn't talk about that.
Okay. Well, so I was super depressed because of Tuesday with Duke losing to Kentucky. Multiple texts.
Wait. When did you all record the podcast last week? Was it Wednesday?
No, I think it was it Wednesday? Maybe it was Wednesday.
I'm just wondering if that had an effect on you on the podcast.
Well, I was probably nervous for the game that night.
I got you.
And so, had a lot of loving church members text me and like, hey, did you see the game? I'm like, yeah, I did. So on Friday we go golfing, and I had, got my first hole in one.
Yeah.
Super excited. And I text my dad. My dad was like, "Well, that's pretty confident of you to say your first hole in one, you know." And I was like, "Oh yeah, this is going to be like a flood from now on." But I was with a lot of people know Ryan Davis at the church. I like drove up to the green, and as soon as I had it in my hand, he sprinted 150 yards, like screaming the whole way.
Nice.
To come and give me a hug. And then I was the first to hit. So once we all stopped like celebrating, we all had to go back to the tee box because everybody else had to tee off. So it made up for it.
Yeah, my husband was there and texted me, and I was like,
Yes.
"Oh, great, we're going to hear about this for a while."
And then we had to have Pastor Joel tell my wife because she didn't believe me when I said it.
Well, if you want Jake's autograph, he's available on Sundays at 10:30 a.m.
Yes.
At Beacon Hill.
Yeah.
So
Try to catch me right before I walk on
even
stage.
even if you don't want his autograph, we'd love to have you come to the church. 9:15 Grow Groups, 10:30 service. And if you're interested in checking us out, you can go to beaconhillbaptist.com. Next week is Thanksgiving week. I'm already excited about that.
Yeah.
Favorite meal of the year.
So maybe we'll talk more about that next week. You all have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Beacon Hill Podcast. For more information about Beacon Hill Baptist Church, visit beaconhillbaptist.com.